Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the actual real video on the best team for every Electro carry. So, when it comes to Electro characters, Electro carries are generally played either in teams that make use of Dendro, whether it's Hyper Bloom teams or Quicken teams. They're often played in teams with Chevaliers. They can be played in teams where you're not really focused too much on reactions and mostly just on the raw damage, but Mono Electro isn't something that sees much play because there's not enough Electro units that are like that powerful as standalones to really justify doing actual Mono Electro teams. There's some Taser teams, but anyways, when it comes to carries, I will be including a few characters that aren't really what most people think about when they think about carries, because there's a lot of teams involving Electro characters that don't really have a dedicated carry, and in those teams, generally, the character that has the highest damage split is the Electro one. So mainly Hyperloom teams, for example. And because of that, in this video that's about Electro carries, you're gonna see some characters that are not traditional carries like Kuki, for example. We're gonna start with OG Electro carry, Keqing. Keqing kind of hasn't really stood the test of time as much as some of the other old units, but she's not completely unusable. When you look at the strength that Keqing has, she has relatively flexible rotations. She doesn't lose any of her buffs or any part of her kit if you have to swap out of her and then swap back in. You can split your rotations fairly easily. Her Electro application is fairly good, which didn't really matter back in 1.0, but with Dendro's release, obviously pretty nice. But her biggest problem is that the numbers on her kit are just not really that good. Because the numbers on her kit aren't really that good, you don't really end up with the best results if you try to play Keqing in a team that tries to capitalize on her non-reaction damage. If you try to play a team that just hyper buffs her, if you look at the old units, you'd be looking at something like, I don't know, Bennett, Kazuha, Sarah, right? Something like this is not good, because Keqing just doesn't really have the numbers to justify a team like this performing all that well. Even if you look at a team using more recent units that are a little bit more tailored towards Electro carry teams, it's not as bad, but it's still not all that amazing. And again, that's just mainly because her numbers are kind of underwhelming. The best part of her kit by far is that her Electro application is pretty decent. And because of that, if you play her in Dendro teams, you can trigger a lot of aggravate. That makes it so that Keqing's best team by far is going to be when paired with Fischl and then a Dendro unit plus a buffer. The unfortunate reality of a team like this, though, is that Keqing is not really doing more damage than Fischl. If we look at a few of the sims of this team, you look at the damage split. This version with Sucrose Nahida, Fischl does more than Keqing. This version with Nahida Farina, Fischl does almost as much as Keqing. This version, Sucrose Kirara, Fischl does more than Keqing. She is kept playable by how powerful Fischl is in Quicken teams, but she herself isn't that amazing. And this is something that's gonna be, I guess, a common factor for a lot of Electro characters' Quicken teams. They get hard carried by Fischl. The reason why Fischl is so good in Electro teams is because of her Ascension 1 passive, Ascension 4 passive, which hits enemies with an attack every time you trigger an Electro-related reaction with your on-field character. Now, if you're on-fielding an Electro character in a Quicken team, it means every time your on-field character applies Electro, they'll trigger Aggravate, which means Fischl will hit with her Ascension 4 passive. But her Ascension 4 passive doesn't have ICD, which means it will also trigger Aggravate. And so you end up with Fischl triggering an Aggravate every time your carry triggers an Aggravate, on top of the Aggravates she triggers at a baseline from Oz. On top of that, the fact that Aggravate does not remove the Quicken aura means that you can consistently trigger Aggravates on your on-fielders, which means you get a larger number of Ascension 4 procs, on top of them doing a lot more damage because they trigger Aggravate. And because of that, you end up with a lot of damage from all of those aggravates you're gaining from Fischl. What that means is that your best teams for Keqing are generally just gonna be these teams. Technically, Keqing has a, surprisingly okay charge attack multiplier. But the biggest problem is that her charge attack knocks enemies back, makes her go backwards a tiny little bit, and comes out quickly enough that it's very stamina negative. All in all, your best teams are still just generally going to be something with Dendro plus a buffer, whether it be Shilonen, Farina. You can use something like Yelan if you want. You can use Kazuha. You can use Xianyuan if you want. But it's pretty much all just gonna be some form of aggravate carried by Fischl. If you don't like Fischl, or if you want to play a team that focuses mostly on Keqing's damage, you're gonna see much worse results, unfortunately. Next Electro carry to talk about is Raiden. Raiden is a character that I think people used to be very positive about, with somewhat good reason, I'd say, and who has started to be perceived as a lot weaker recently. I'll start by talking about traditional Raiden builds. In terms of just the output that Raiden provides, her damage is honestly pretty underwhelming. Her kit is balanced around her ability to generate energy for the rest of your team. Because of that, if you focus entirely on her damage, you're not gonna see the best results, which means that most of her good teams have more than one character doing a significant portion of the damage. Does that mean you can't play her in a team where she's the main source of damage? No, but it does mean that those teams are worse. The most popular Raiden team from the time she came out to pretty much the middle of Fontaine was Raiden National. And the reason why this team was popular is because Xiangling is broken. This team has more of its damage coming from Xiangling than from Raiden. And on top of that, this team has been buffed somewhat recently by the overload buffs, which buff Xiangling's damage even more, but don't really do anything for Raiden's damage. The sad part about a team like this is that the optimal build for Raiden here is not even a fully damage-focused one. If you're looking at just optimal DPS, your best build on Raiden is going to be Fav on TOM, because the 20% attack buff to Xiangling and Xingqiu from TOM does more for your team's DPS than her being on Emblem, even though Emblem is really good for her damage, because her personal damage is just not that great. Now, in practice, I don't actually recommend doing Fav TOM, because Raiden's ability to front load damage with her burst can be helpful to quickly take care of a first wave and lead into a second wave. Personally, I lean more towards Fav Emblem as a build to default towards for Raiden in a team like this. A team like this is honestly pretty solid. Even to this day, it's still fine. The biggest upside that it has is that it's incredibly easy to play. Your rotations are very straightforward. You have a lot of like wiggle room for when to use Xingqiu Burst. So as long as you remember to use Bennett Burst before Xiangling and Raiden, you kind of can't really f it up. But the downside that it has is that it's not that powerful. Now, I think it's important to realize that something not being that strong doesn't mean it can't clear things. Abyss HP inflation has been pretty blatant lately, but instead of just doing HP inflation, they mix HP inflation with matchup dependent enemies, the sort of enemies that will be easy to clear with some teams and hard to clear with other teams based on the types of things your teams do. So elemental shields, but also resistances, special mechanics that reward specific things, whatever. All in all, in terms of the amount of different enemies and different types of enemies that a team like this can deal with, it's actually not bad, and so it's still a pretty solid team. But what about other Raiden teams? Chevaleur's release actually gave Raiden a lot more options, and I'd say more importantly, has made those options stronger. You can do something like this with an Electro unit on the last slot, or you can do something with a Pyro unit on the last slot, or you can ditch the Bennett. Personally, my favorite Chevaleur's team with Raiden has been this one, but you honestly won't see that big of a difference in clear speed between a team like this and like the 7-8 different variations of a Chevaleur's Raiden team you can do. Now, the reality is that Hoyo has definitely leaned in the direction of actual power creep lately. And when you compare the performance of a team like this with the performance of a more recent Electro carry, Raiden is just not impressive at all. And the newer Electro units are honestly comparable to Raiden with Constellations. Now, because a lot of Raiden's teams have a good amount of damage coming from the rest of your team and not just from herself, even though Raiden is noticeably worse than those other units, the teams aren't that much worse. The ability to have a lot of damage coming from the rest of your team, a lot of damage coming from Fischl and from Xiangling in this team, for example, allows her to still be able to keep up with the Abyss Abyss HP thresholds at the very least. So if you have a Raiden and you want to play her, she's still very much playable. You can technically do the same thing as Keqing with Raiden. If anything, it's probably about as good with Raiden, if not better, than with Keqing. But it's generally not what I'd lean towards for Raiden, because I prefer her other team options over these. And the one team option I like the most with Raiden is the one where you forget Raiden has a burst. Yeah, Raiden's best team, and in my eyes, by far, and it's not even close, is Raiden Hyper Bloom. To this day, Raiden Hyper Bloom is still competitive with meta teams. It's not to the point of being one of your two best teams if you have all units anymore. Thank you, Mawika, I guess. But it is very much strong enough to be a consideration for a team you can play when content counters your Mawika. Hyper Bloom teams generally are built with one trigger, a Dendro unit, ideally Nahida, and a Hydro unit, ideally Singto. And then your last slot can kind of be anything. You can go for something just strongly for defensive utility, seek Lolly, get some freeze up time and some defensive utility. You can use a healer if you want. If you want more offensive focused option, you can use a character like Fischl. You can use a character like Yelan, do double Hydro. You can also use characters like Alhaitham, right? Because a team like this doesn't necessarily need to be on field for any of these characters to function. The main upside that Raiden has in these Hyper Bloom teams is, while her ICD on her skill isn't particularly great, Hyper Bloom doesn't really care that much about your ICD. You can trigger Hyper Bloom on an attack that doesn't apply Electro to enemies, because internal cooldown is enemy specific or entity specific or whatever, which means that if you have something that is supposed to apply an element every other hit, and you hit a first enemy, and then you go hit another enemy, you'll apply the element to that second enemy as well. Because for that second enemy, it's your first attack. But that works the same way with the Bloom seeds you generate when you trigger Bloom, which means no matter what, your Electro attacks will always trigger Hyper Bloom, no matter what your internal cooldown is against Bloom seeds. And because of that, considering the fact that Raiden's skill hits about once every second, she actually is one of, if not the best, triggers for Hyper Bloom. Now, there are off-field Electro characters that hit more often. So, for example, Dori's burst hits every 0.4 seconds, so it actually hits more often than Raiden's does. However, all of those characters that hit faster have another downside that prevents them from actually being better. In Dori's case, it's the fact that, well, her burst only lasts 12 seconds. It doesn't have full uptime, and it's a burst, so you need to build energy, you need to build ER on her, which means you won't be able to get as much elemental mastery. Because EM Raiden's burst doesn't matter, you don't need to build any ER on her. On top of that, the duration of her skill is 25 seconds, and the cooldown is 10, which means it lasts forever, and you're not really gated into any sort of duration length because your skill cooldown is really short. As long as you reuse it at some point during your rotation, you're fine. Raiden's ability to apply Electro to Hyper Bloom scenes really quickly, with great uptime, low cooldowns, no energy requirements, makes her a unit that's very, very well suited to being the dedicated Hyper Bloom trigger in your teams. On top of that, she has a nice bonus with her elemental burst damage buff coming from her skill. You get 0.3% burst damage per point of energy cost on your characters. So a character with an 80 cost gains 24 burst damage. These Hyper Bloom teams, right, their main source of damage is Raiden. Raiden is doing often more than half of your team's DPS, with 95% of that being Hyper Bloom damage. And although it's not her abilities themselves that are doing it, it's all going to be green damage, it's still her damage. And that's why I want to talk about it as an Electro carry team. You can also do some weird scuffed hybrid Raiden stuff with something like this plus a healer. It also works. But at that point, I feel like you're kind of just riding the coattails of Hyper Bloom being broken, and it won't be better than the Hyper Bloom teams. So I don't like them too much. Next Electro character I want to talk about, I guess Kuki. We can quickly mention Kuki. Kuki in the Hyper Bloom teams is pretty much the same as Raiden, and it's pretty much the only team where you use Kuki as a pseudo carry. Kuki's main upside in Hyper Bloom teams is that she's a healer. Her being a healer means that you have defensive utility from your Electro trigger, which means that you don't need to get defensive utility from your last slot if you feel like you need to have it on your team. In exchange for that, though, her hits are slower. She hits every 1.5 seconds instead instead of about 1 second. Her duration is shorter. She has a burst that lasts 12 seconds at C0, 15 at C2, with a 15-second cooldown, which means if you have 20-second rotations, 21-ish, like you do with Cyno, you have to either do, like, swap back to Kuki at weird moments just to reactivate her skill when it's over, or you don't have full uptime on it. She consumes her own HP, which means if you're never on-fielding her at all, you'll get to 1 HP at some point, and if you don't have her C6, you're just gonna die. In my experience, I actually tend to die more often with Kuki on the team than with Raiden on the team, because throughout multiple abyss chambers, unless you actually like go out of your way to heal Kuki will bring herself to 1 hit away from death, and I generally don't struggle to stay relatively healthy on my teams even without a healer. But with Kuki, I don't stay relatively healthy, and I just die. But that's just from personal experience. Depending on how well you dodge, that might not be the case for you. Those Kuki teams are generally worse than the Raiden teams for Hyper Bloom. They can be better when you're using Farina, but the Farina teams are generally worse in pure Hyper Bloom stuff. Now we can talk about Yai. A lot of people compare her to Fischl, but honestly, I think that she's a lot more similar to the other Electro carries than she is to Fischl. She spends a lot more time on field than Fischl, and most of her good teams also use Fischl, and you end up using her in the place of an Electro carry with Fischl doing what Fischl does. When it comes to Yai teams, generally, you're mainly looking at either the Dendra teams or the Chivalrous teams. You can do other stuff. You can do Taser, for example. The biggest issue with Taser is just that a lot of what Taser has going for it is its ability to keep enemies staggered. Electrocharge has very good staggered or poise damage, and it constantly ticks on enemies, which can prevent them from recovering their poise, which is a lot of words to say you'll stagger the enemies more with Electrocharge teams than other teams. Yai is fine in Taser teams, but it's honestly not where she shines the most. In my eyes, Yai's best teams when you're using her as a carry or a pseudo carry are either the Dendra teams in the same way where you'd use Keqing, like I mentioned at the start, but unlike Keqing, Yai actually has some off-field presence, which just makes her outright better in teams that generally have a decent amount of swapping involved, like those Aggravate teams. But also, I think Yai does quite well in Chivalrous teams. You can use Yai as a support in Chivalrous teams, but honestly, I don't like it too much for most of those. And what I actually like from Yai in Chivalrous teams is using her in a team where she kind of is the dedicated on-fielder, even if she's not doing that much of your team DPS. In a team like Yai, Fischl, Chivalrous, Shangling. I've talked about this team with Raiden as well, and I actually like it about as much with Yai as I do with Raiden. I haven't done too much testing with Yai Iansan yet, unfortunately, because I don't have Yai on my account, but Iansan should be fairly solid in a team like this. Losing out on Fischl's damage is a pretty big deal, but when you're on-fielding Yai, at least you get a good amount of uptime on Iansan's buff. And more importantly, Xiaoling's getting the Iansan buff fully snapshotted, which is a pretty big deal too. I guess one thing to mention is when you're doing teams like this, right, you will end up having a mix of quicken uptime and Hyper Bloom damage, and I think it's interesting to talk about. Generally, you'll either go Hyper Bloom or you'll go quicken. However, if you're using a Hydro character with relatively slow application in a solo Hydro team, you can end up effectively getting the best of both worlds, getting Hyper Bloom damage without actually losing your quicken. Applying Hydro on a quicken aura does not break the aura. You have to apply Hydro twice to destroy the quicken aura. What that means is that if your Electro and Dendra application are faster than your Hydro, you'll be able to maintain quicken on the enemies despite applying Hydro and triggering Bloom. Now, the downside to that is obviously, well, if your Hydro's slower, it means you're getting less Blooms. But that's not enough of a downside to make these teams not work. And you can effectively look at it as a trade-off that's generally somewhat DPS neutral. Obviously, it'll depend on the characters. Some characters gain a bit more, some characters gain a bit less from the quicken uptime, but as a general rule, you lose about as much as you gain from lowering your Hydro application for characters that can take advantage of the quicken uptime. And so characters that have good synergy with Farina, but don't do a lot of normal attacks, or have a lot of personal damage, or have a lot of application, so you want to trigger more aggravates, for example, might end up in situations where a team like this will perform better than a team that doesn't that doesn't have any Hydro for a Quicken team, and a team that has a lot of Hydro or Hyperloom teams. Next, we can talk about Cyno. All in all, he's about as average as a character can get, honestly. His biggest downside is that he has a relatively long uptime window that doesn't allow you to swap out, which hurts his synergy with characters like Fischl that have a 12-second duration, but where you can refresh your abilities if you swap back to her. That by itself is arguably his biggest downside. Despite that, his teams are still kind of reasonable. Now, they're not great, don't get me wrong. Cyno's not a particularly great unit, but he does have some reasonable teams. When it comes to Cyno teams, there's so many teams that perform very similarly to one another, because the teams that run better units, well, those better units tend to have worse synergy with Cyno, and the worse units tend to have better synergy. And that leads to a situation where there's a lot of variety in Cyno teams. You can play Cyno in a traditional aggravate team, something like this maybe, but his anti-synergy with Fischl can be a bit of a problem here, and obviously his inability to swap out mid-rotation means that in multi-wave content, Nahida feels like you can do some Quick Bloom stuff with this. You can do Quick Bloom stuff using a healer in the last slot here, and it, like, works, I guess. You can do Quick Bloom without Farina, using a unit like Yelan, for example. You can do some Burgeon stuff using Toma, or this. You can do Burning Load stuff, something like this. Use Emilie instead if you want. You can even do Chevreuse teams. Now, Cyno has some EM scaling and EM from his stuff, but even if he's not triggering reactions, he's still okay. And because of that, a team like this is still pretty reasonable. And because Chevreuse is such a powerful character, it can kind of carry his ass, honestly. You can also do teams using Baiju as your Dendro instead of Nahida. That allows you to play Farina, and then you got a flexible last slot. And honestly, all of those Cyno teams, in my experience, tend to have very, very similar clear times unless they are countered by the content. So for example, a team like this will be a lot slower in that recent Abyss that had 5 Ruin enemies in a row. Yeah, you've got a lot of flexibility for Cyno teams, but none of them are going to be particularly great. And I guess we can compare that to the next character on the list, which is Sethos. Sethos is kind of the exact opposite. Sethos' teams do not have a lot of flexibility, but they can actually be pretty good. Sethos is an interesting character because playing Sethos well is really difficult. There's a massive difference in terms of the results you can expect from a good Sethos versus an average Sethos versus a bad Sethos. Sethos' best default combo is N2W, so 2 normal attacks into a walk. Now, the reason for that is because a walk cancel is faster than a dash cancel, in Sethos' case at least here, because he doesn't have a lot of end lag on his normal attack animation, but if you don't cancel at all, right, you'll do the 3rd attack. If you don't cancel, right, you'll do the 3rd attack no matter what. And so doing a walk cancel makes him reset his attack string, basically. This is good because it's 3 hits, which means you get to have very favorable ICD stuff because the N2 is a double hit. And the 3rd hit is bad. An important reason for that is because the amount of damage you get from Sethos' burst on his normal attacks is the same no matter which attack it is. And so that slower 3rd attack that deals more damage gets the same burst buff as the faster first 2 attacks. If you just do N3 spam, you get 1. You can get like about 4-ish. But if you do some walk cancels, you can get 7. And you end up just dealing a lot more damage if you do that. Now, frame perfect walk cancels increase your damage a lot, but because the cancels happens relatively quickly after one another, you get punished a lot more for each frame of delay on your cancels. On top of that, Sethos has a lot of flexibility in his rotations because of his charge attacks. Now, Sethos' charge attack effectively comes out a lot faster by costing energy. And once you run out of energy, it's very, 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 very slow. That charge attack, if you spam it, is stronger than spamming his normal attacks. However, it consumes a lot more energy, which means you get a lot less damage per point of energy. And if you build enough ER that you can spend as much time charge attacking as you would normal attacking, his damage becomes a lot worse. But his ability to do that means that when he needs to front load damage, if you have an enemy that has a very short uptime window, he can get a lot of damage out in a short amount of time. And finally, you can do your charge attacks on Sethos, and instead of waiting until you do the full animation, you can do short hold charge attacks. Like this. And those consume a lot less energy. The way that Sethos' charge attack works is when aiming, the charge time is decreased by 0.285 seconds based on each point of his current EM, and it can go down to a minimum of 0.3 seconds. And then, once you're fully charged, you consume 20 energy if you reduce it to minimum to get your shot out. However, if you don't fully hold it, you only consume half of that energy. If you're below 20 energy, you still charge faster, but it's not going to be at the minimum amount of time. It's not going to be the maximum speed. The thing is, as long as you charge faster at all, you will start doing a hold level 1 charge attack. Even if you don't fully charge it, you'll still get the aim shot charge level 1. And this gets Electro infused, no matter what, as long as you have enough energy to activate this effect. Even if you hold it for like only 1 frame, it's still going to be Electro damage. What that means is that if you spam his charge shots without waiting for them to become shadow piercing shots, they do a lot less damage, they don't have any EM scaling, but they're still Electro application with no ICD, so each one of them can aggravate. What that means is that if you need to extend your rotation for whatever reason, you can start spamming those charge shots like that and get aggravates on each one. Now my Sethos build is Omega Scuffed, so we don't talk about that, but I can show you what that leads to in practice. Right? I noticed that the enemy is like kind of almost dead, so I can, oops. It's a bit hard because my build is kind of scuffed, but if the enemy didn't have, or if I did a little bit more damage, you can end up in a situation where the enemy has like 20% HP remaining, and then you can just spam charge attacks to finish him off. And it effectively gives you some flexibility that allows you to do a slightly longer rotation with more damage without having to do your whole setup again. There's a lot of nuance to Sethos gameplay, and that's why there's such a large difference in performance between a good Sethos and an average Sethos and a bad Sethos. Personally, I'm a bad Sethos. I suck at playing that character, and I also don't have him properly built, nor do I have constellations on him, so I'm not inclined to learn or improve my Sethos gameplay. There's also a lot of tech on Sethos, for example, the tax evasion tech. Energy consumption is a server-side thing, which means that with higher ping, it happens later, but that includes the energy you consume from his shadow piercing shots. Because of that, you can actually use your burst after a shadow piercing shot as long as you have enough ping, because you can effectively use your burst before the energy gets consumed. But when you just look at the damage that Sethos do, he's actually one of the better Electro carries. Like a properly played Sethos, even without taking a look at the flexibility of his rotations, just in his default best rotations with N2W spam, is actually up there as one of the strongest Electro carries. Most 4-star carries kind of suck, right? Sethos is like the second best 4-star carry. But him being really hard to play does introduce some potential scuff. Now, Sethos teams, pretty much always Dendro teams. He's a character with noticeably good EM scaling compared to his attack scaling. So you want to build him with a lot of EM, which means you're going to have a lot of EM. So you definitely want to be playing him in teams where he's triggering reactions. And when it comes to Electro reactions, Electro Charge is hard to reliably trigger with any given character because you'll have Electro Charge ownership shared with all of your different elemental applicators. It can be difficult to reliably trigger Overload with him because you need to have very, very fast application from the rest of your team in order to do that. But Aggravate, you can trigger reliably every time he applies Electro. And you can also get some Hyper Blooms if you play him in Quick Bloom teams. But yeah, as a general rule, Sethos very much wants to be played with Fischl in honestly most, if not all of his teams. Technically, you can do some weird stuff like double Hydro with Shilonen, but like that's not really a Sethos team anymore at that point. You can get away with playing Quickbloom teams with like this, for example, and it works. But he really truly shines in his teams where you're using Fischl. And then either Nahida Shilonen, or you can use Kirara. Kirara is a pretty popular unit with him. Kirara Sucrose is pretty good. You can also play him in Quick Burn teams, or sorry, Burning Load teams with Maoika, because Maoika is kind of goated. You can also use with Shanling as well. One of the nice upsides of these teams is Sethos is a character who's a lot more EM focused than most aggravate carries, which means he generally ends up with more EM, which means his overloads hit harder than most Electro characters' overloads. Though obviously, he gains more from maintaining Burning Aura on enemies and getting both aggravate and overload. Yeah, you can do Chivalrous teams as well, but they're not quite as good, unfortunately. Next, we can quickly mention Dori. Dori pretty much only has one team. C6 Dori has an Electro Infusion, which allows her to be used as the carry in some teams. The fact that she has very, very, very potent healing means that she has great synergy with Farina. And getting healing from your Electro unit means that you don't need healing from the rest of your team to enable Farina, which allows you to get away with using Nahida and Fischl. I don't think Dori as a carry is ever worth playing outside of this specific team, but this specific team is actually pretty good, considering how bad of a unit Dori is overall. Next, we can talk about Clorinde. Clorinde is a unit that I think is very representative of the Electro element and its versatility. I think you can describe Clorinde in a somewhat similar way as the way I described Cyno, in the sense that she has a lot of different teams that aren't that far away from one another. Unlike Cyno, she's a little bit stronger. She can be played in pure quicken teams, and when you compare her performance in those teams to a unit like Keqing, the fact that Clorinde just has better numbers, on top of the fact that she also has pretty good elemental application, just makes her outright better. There's two different ways you can play Clorinde in these teams. You can either go for a team that focuses a bit more on Clorinde's damage, go for a Whimsy build with a 16-ish second rotation, or you can go for a team that focuses more on Fischl's damage and go TF Clorinde and do basically a double 12-second rotation that allows you to have full Oz uptime. And honestly, those two teams tend to perform pretty much exactly as well as one another. Like, there's very, very, very little difference in output between those teams. Generally, the TF versions are a little bit better, but they're also a bit harder to play optimally. That being said, the fact that it's a double 12-second-ish rotation means that you effectively have more flexibility in your rotations. If you kill the enemy halfway through your rotation, you don't get punished as hard for swapping out to refresh your Nahida skill. So I tend to prefer the TF version. However, the TF build doesn't work on some of her teams, and so if you're only gonna have one Clorinde team and you don't want to have to re-gear her all the time, you just leave her on Whimsy, or Glad if you don't have a great Whimsy. Anyways, this is for the quicken teams. Obviously, here I'm using Shilonen, Nahida as an example, but you can also do Animo unit Nahida, or Shilonen a different Dendro unit, or Animo unit a different Dendro unit. Kirara is a fairly popular choice. Pretty big reason why Kirara is popular is because of Calamity of Eshu. Calamity of Eshu is a really good weapon for Clorinde, assuming you stay shielded. The biggest problem is if you get hit and your shield breaks, you lose the buff. But if you do stay shielded, it's like actually really, really good on her. But yeah, so these teams all fairly solid. But Clorinde is also one of the units that benefits the most from being played in these Quickbloom teams with Farina, because while she's not a team-wide healer like Dori is, she does have the ability to heal herself. Now, by default, her self-healing isn't that good. Clorinde's default gameplay is normal attack until you have over 100 bond of life, and once you're at 100 bond of life, use your skill to dash forward, or backwards, or sideways, or whatever, to dash. When she uses her skill, she heals 110% of her bond of life, but bond of life is like kind of like an anti-shield for healing, so that 110% bond of life healing means that she's healing that first 100% and then remaining 10%. If she does 3 attacks, it brings her to 105% of her max HP as bond of life, which means that she heals 10% of that 105%, so 10.5% of her max HP every time she consumes her bond of life. What that means is effectively every time you use your skill during your uptime, you heal 10% of your HP. But it has an interesting interaction with healing bonus, because the number that gets increased by your healing bonus is not the remaining healing here, this 10%, it's the total healing. In other words, if you add a healing bonus here, if you have 10% healing bonus, instead of increasing this 10% to 11%, it'll increase this 10% to 20%. You can think of it as each point of healing bonus being worth about 10. 1% more healing bonus is actually kind of like 10% healing bonus for her self-healing. 10% is about 100%. Because Furina's burst gives you healing bonus based on your fanfare, and because you can get upwards of 30% healing bonus, it effectively means that Clorinde's self-healing, when Furina has her burst activated, is significantly more than her self-healing by default. So much more that she can pretty much be the only form of healing in your Furina team and still have pretty good fanfare generation. Now, from what I've seen, it seems like Proto Amber is still technically the best weapon on Nahida. Having a little bit more healing is nice, but you don't even really need it. Anyways, the fact that she has a lot of self-healing, despite it not being as much fanfare generation as what Dori gets from her AoE healing, well, obviously Clorinde does more damage than Dori does, so you get to make up for that in that way. And a team like this actually performs quite well. That's another option you have on Clorinde. Next is Chevreur's teams. Chevreur's teams are generally her stronger teams if you have Constellations on Chevreur's. If you don't have Constellations on Chevreur's, it's a lot closer to her other ones. But something like this, obviously, does quite well. But you don't even have to use Fischl or Maoika specifically here. You have flexibility for both of the slots. You can go Iansan, you can go Sarah, you can go Xiangling, you can go Toma if you want. You can go Auroron. But yeah, those teams just perform fairly well. You can also do Burning Load, something like this again, or using Emily, using Xiangling, right? These versions all work as well. You can go a little crazy. I know there's some people that like using Yunjin with her, and it technically works, even though personally I'm not a fan. You can obviously also do some double hydro stuff like this, like you can with a lot of other characters. All in all, Clorinde has a lot of flexibility in her teams. Everything performs pretty well. And finally, we have the newest Electro carry, Varesa. I think Varesa is kind of less of an Electro unit in the sense that I said Clorinde is a unit that represents Electro really well with her versatility. I don't think Varesa has nearly as much versatility. I think Varesa has basically two main ways you can play her. You can play her with Chevreur's, you can play her with Furina. Varesa doesn't have the best application, but in exchange for that, she has much higher numbers for her just outright damage. In other words, her Dendro-focused teams tend to perform worse, but her teams that focus on her personal damage tend to perform better. I'd say that Varesa likely is the strongest Electro carry now, but if you're not playing her in one of her two good teams, you'll probably see worse results than you do with Clorinde. So the Chevreur's team, you really want some Electro character. That Electro character can be Fischl, can be Iansan, can be Sarah. I think the best one is Iansan. Next is Sarah, and finally Fischl. For most characters, Fischl tends to be better, but the reason for that is because Fischl has pretty good personal damage. Varesa has 20-25 balanced numbers, which means that you will just see better performance from putting her with a character that buffs her damage over a character that does damage themselves. And finally, your Pyro character, Maoika, is better than a character like Xiangling, but Xiangling still completely works. The biggest downside to using Xiangling is that Xiangling's burst has a 20-second cooldown. A little bit more than that, actually, because her burst has a cast time and the cooldown doesn't start until halfway through the animation, which slows down your Varesa rotations and forces you to effectively spend more time on her. But Varesa only has so much time you can spend on her before you kind of run out of steam. I don't think I have my builds properly, but I can still show what it looks like. If you do your setup like this, alright, if you do something like this, then you swap back to Chevreur's, then Iansan, then to Xiangling, you see, we're still on cooldown, right? This rotation don't work. Because of that, what you're gonna end up doing is you're gonna end up adding some normal charge attacks into your rotation to make it pretty much exactly the amount of time it needs to be. Oops. And in my experience, adding those 2 charge attacks on Varesa makes the rotation pretty much exactly 20 seconds. Or 20 point something from channeling. But Varesa's charge attack feels like awful. It feels so goddamn bad because of how slow it is and because you can get staggered while doing the charge attack. And if you don't do 2 of them, you won't be able to start your next rotation with an enhanced plunge. And you really want to be able to do that. Because of that, I tend to much prefer the Mawika teams. But as long as you're willing to work with the long and annoying charge attack animation, the channeling teams aren't that much worse, honestly. Yeah, you can also technically do Bennett, but personally, I don't like it very much. I'd say that if you're using a Varesa Traverse team, you definitely should be using an off-field Pyro that's doing something like channeling or Mawika. Yeah, you can use Pyro MC as well. I keep forgetting Pyro MC exists. Sorry, you can use Pyro MC as well. The other option that she has is teams with Farina. Now, with Farina, you still very much want to Electro. Electro Resonance actually helps her a lot. With Electro Resonance, her EO requirements are pretty trivial. If she's solo Electro, her EO requirements are through the roof. Anyways, your last slot here, the best one by far is Xianyan, but if you don't have Xianyan, you can get away using a character like Shailonin. You could use Jean, but Jean is a lot more sus. But obviously, you want it to be a healer so they can properly enable Farina. Then, if you don't want to play a team like this, right, you can still do a Dendro team with something like this. Obviously, though, like I said, it'll be worse. Will it be so much worse that it's, like, worse than Keqing? No. Even with relatively bad application, just the raw numbers are enough to make it better than the relatively bad Electro carries, but it's gonna be significantly worse than her actual strong teams. Hi YouTube, this is the Jeff from like 2 days after recording. I've had more time to test Varesa, and I've kind of changed my mind on a few things with her. I still think that in terms of team archetypes, Varesa is less versatile than Clorinde. However, after doing extended testing on her teams, even the suboptimal versions of Varesa's teams tend to perform better than I expected them to. I still think you shouldn't be playing a quicken team with something like this, for example. I think it's not like Varesa's particularly good in here because she has pretty bad synergy with quicken. But I've kind of realized if you're not, you know, doing the typical quicken stuff and you were to do something like this with Varesa, with the Iansan, this actually still performs pretty well, not because of quicken being helpful for the team, but just because unironically, this 3-unit team is kind of good enough. The aggravates don't really help Varesa's damage that much, but Varesa's numbers are a little inflated compared to Clorinde, and honestly, a 3-unit team with her kind of does almost as well as a Clorinde team. She's definitely not on the same level as Mawika as a carry. Like, don't get me wrong, but she's able to do so much from her own kit that she performs a bit better than I expected her to in suboptimal teams. The main thing that really helped solidify that opinion in my mind in the past few days is realizing just how flexible her rotations are, which allows her to work really well with a bunch of different units, whether they're units that force you to have longer rotations or units that allow you to have shorter rotations. The fact that she can adapt her combos based on how much free time you have to spend on her allows her to have a lot more functional teammates than I initially gave her credit for. I will get into a lot more detail on Varesa's teams in the post-release analysis video that I plan on recording relatively soon, but I just wanted to make this clear. I think suboptimal Varesa teams are better than I expected them to be. I'll leave you guys back with Zajeff from 2 days ago for the rest of the video. Thundering Fury Erasure. Okay, if you want to play Razor, don't, but if you want to play Razor anyways, he only has one team and it's this. Physical Razor is completely worthless, but Razor's ability to have an effectively an Electro coordinated attack while he's on field that isn't an infusion means that he can hit with both Electro and Pyro at the same time, which allow him to take advantage of Bennett's Pyro infusion, and his Electro is going to help you weaken auras on enemies so that you can trigger more blooms. It'll weaken Burning Aura applied from his Pyro attacks, so you can trigger more blooms. It will also trigger Overload, which, because he's built full EM in a team like this, deals a good amount of damage. But also, his self-Electro application in his burst, paired with Bennett's self-Pyro application, triggers Overload on yourself, which doesn't actually knock you away or deal damage to you, but it does do Overload, and it deals damage to nearby enemies. So this is actually a pretty reasonable team. Now, unfortunately, as is the case with Virgin teams in general, it's a lot weaker in single target than it is in AoE, and as is the case with other Curry teams, which are version teams with an Electro unit. It's better in AoE, but if you're against non-heavy enemies, they get knocked away. So it's pretty much the sort of team that only truly shines against heavy AoE enemies, like triple Kenki, like double Earth Guard, stuff like that. But yeah, I haven't mentioned Iansan in quicken teams too much. Iansan is actually a pretty reasonable option in quicken teams, not as a replacement to Fischl, but on top of Fischl instead of your like Anemo or Shilon and Slon. Main reason for that is because Fischl snapshots. Yeah, that's right. Fischl is the reason why it works. Again, what a surprise. But yeah, that pretty much does it for the best teams for all the Electro carries. As a general rule, Electro carries tend to be fairly versatile in terms of their team building, but you'll often see them relying on either Nahida, Farina, or Chevreuse. Those 3 units tend to be the common factors in the Electro carries teams, and also on either Fischl or Iansan. I mean, if you've watched the April Fool's video, like, I posted as a joke, but honestly, it's not even necessarily wrong. A 3-unit team with Mawika, Benazit, Lali is honestly better than the best team of most Electro carries. I think Varesa has teams that are good enough to be better than a 3-unit team with Mawika, Benazit, Lali. I think Clorinde does as well. And I think Raiden, if you include Hyperbloom, does as well. Frame Perfect Sethos too. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of just a tragedy that's a consequence of Mawika being Mawika. It is what it is. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you had a good, hope you learned a thing or two. Hope you had a good time. And I will see you guys on the next one. Bye, YouTube.